Something very interesting and actually very poorly understood is language. So, as many of you are aware, there are a lot of languages in the world. But obviously, as it's been proven through anthropological studies, we all came from somewhere, billions, not billions, sorry, like thousands or even millions of years ago. So at one point, we were all communicating each other at that one place, Africa, by the way, that we lived. And then we spread out across the globe. And as that happened, as we got separated, different languages started to emerge and develop and be created. So a lot of people nowadays, especially when it comes to English and slang and the internet slang especially, say that we're bastardizing language and that we are destroying it and we're ruining it and all this other bullshit. And I say it is bullshit because look at the way language works. People who say that have a fundamental lack of understanding on how language works. Now, for example, most people have heard of Esperanto. It's what most people call an artificial language, a language that was made up by people, but specific people, to be used. It was a combination of several other languages using the most simple grammar they could think of to be used globally, to replace all other languages. Now, it didn't take off. In fact, very few people speak it nowadays. So that's really interesting that didn't take off. And most people think, well, it's a made-up language, it's an artificial language. Aren't all languages that way? And not really, because this is what happens. Now, let's look at Latin-based languages. Now, it's called Latin-based languages because where did it come from? It came from all these languages started off as one. So we have several languages across Europe that all came from one language, Latin, back in the ancient Roman times. That was the language they spoke. And then they had colonized all of Europe, pretty much, and slowly over time, but not all of Europe, because there was still places that like the Visigoths and and the barbarians and everything else had, so they spoke Germanic or Slavic languages, but they had a decent amount of land too. So in Europe, you have your Latin-based languages, you have your Slavic languages, and your Germanic languages. So, but over the centuries and over time, the different parts, different areas started, the language was evolving, and slowly, separated, you develop different accents for every single language. Depending on where that language is spoken in the world, people speak it differently. For example, English is the best example because English has the most, geographical diversity due to the colonization during most of the 19th century. Anyways, so if you take a person from England or a person from US or Canada or something, we obviously speak very, very differently, both in just our accents, but even the words we use. So what happens when people get separated is that you start having an accent, and it starts getting more and more separated from the original. And then after a while, new words are being thrown in there. And the thing is that the reason why the artificial language didn't work is it was a few people plotting out the whole language, whereas natural language progression is every now and then someone throws a new word in, or or takes a term that already exists and change it a little bit to mean something else, and that keeps on happening like that. And then you get from an accent, using all this different slang and everything else that develops, you get a new dialect in the same language. So people who have different dialects in the same language, they can figure it out and try to get each other to understand. They can figure it out a lot better than two different languages with the same base. The different dialects can still communicate a lot better because they still have most of their language being the same. But then after a while, when the dialect gets so heavy that people of the same language can't understand each other anymore, is when you start getting a new language. And then over time, that continues to separate from each other, which is why we have, say, Latin started out everyone speaking the same, but then over the centuries and eventually millennia, we started getting French, Spanish, and Italian, and, several others. And so like that, that separation happened. So it's the natural progression of how language just works. Now, I use the European example because the way everything's whitewashed and everything else, most of these people who are ignorant of this fact, and most English speakers, which is the language I'm using to explain this video, are aware of the Latin-based languages. But that happened all over everywhere in the world, all over Asia, all over North America before the Europeans came, South America, Central America, like all over the world this has happened, all over Africa, everywhere this has happened, because that's just how language works. Because they have found the one language we all started speaking, the one root language to every language in the world, and you can tell how different Mandarin is to French or whatever. It's completely different, because over the millennia of this process happening, for accents, dialects, the new language, and those new languages can be the roots of other new languages even. It keeps on happening like that. So that's just the natural progression of things. So if we compare even in English, something that's relatable, the first thing that we have, the oldest thing that we have that's written in the English language is Beowulf, and it's an epic poem. Try fucking understanding that shit. It feels like it's in a totally different language, but it is English. That is the oldest form of English. And then even just go, 400 years ago to frickin' Shakespeare. That shit's really hard to understand for most people. And that was only 400 years ago. In 400 years, the English language has evolved that much. And even people who speak, with their slang and their dialect in Ireland or England or whatever, people in freaking New York or something aren't going to be able to understand them. Or Newfoundland or wherever the fuck you're from. That you can't understand it as well, because they're starting to develop the dialect. It's more than the accent, it's the dialect because of the slang you're using. Except this interesting phenomenon happened with the internet, is that we have, instead of relying on geographical location to create new dialects, instead of the real world, it's a virtual world, a virtual place that's creating this new dialect. And because of this, you can get people speaking this dialect from all over the world. And it's really actually quite interesting from an anthropological point of view. So from this new way, people have means of communicating things in ways they never could before, and with terms that just before no one would care for, and it wouldn't take off. So seemingly meaningless or stupid things like I can't even, or I've lost there's this particular article that I'll link in the description, I've lost all ability to can. Most people will be like, what? But people who are immersed enough in the internet dialect, because it is a dialect, it's not just internet slang, it's become its own dialect, because people who aren't on the internet, so like older people who don't go on the internet 24 hours a day or whatever, I know it's an extreme exaggeration, but who aren't constantly on the internet using this dialect, they can't understand a word you're saying. It's developing its own, they can understand, but they can't understand the dialect very well. Same way, they can communicate, but they can't use their dialects to communicate. They have to trace back to the closest route to communicate with each other. If we have someone from France and Spain, 2,000 years ago or whatever, 1,500 years ago or whatever, it's when it was still going into dialects, not quite languages yet, and all this other stuff. So that's how that all happened. And another thing too is colonization of places can oftentimes mix two languages together, and that's exactly what happened with English. English is half Germanic and half Latin, well, less than half Latin actually, with a little bit of everything else mixed in. So that's what that was, because it was Germanic, with the Anglo and Celtic and the Gaelic languages, and then they were colonized by the Romans, and then that got Latin into there, which is why there's some words that we have parallel with German, modern German, and there's some words we have parallel with modern Latin-based languages because of that merger of the two languages. And because of English, colonizing all these places, we have that sort of thing happening all over the place too, this kind of merger. And even in North America, depending on what kind of person you're talking to and what their cultural backgrounds are, they're going to be speaking differently to you. Because I've met people who are, most of the people they know are Muslim. So their English is like a merge of English and Arabic almost. Or like all sorts of things like this. I've seen it happen where groups where a lot of people are from a certain descent, it's the language of that descent starts to merge with English, and then they develop their own dialect from that. I mean, a perfect example would be Newfoundland. Now, no, that's not actually a perfect example, but as far as English goes, but even in the accent of it, because Newfoundland is in Canada, but the accent is like halfway between an Irish accent and a Canadian accent. Now, that's a very simplified way, which now doesn't really have the language as much, but it has the dialect from Ireland mixed with the dialect from Canada. So that's a really interesting thing, because most of the people in Ireland are of Irish descent. Or, I'm trying to think of another place that has this. I think Australia, they have a very, unique way of saying things. So I think that's from the native Australian people. I think it's Aborigines or something is the right term. I'm not sure. Or India, where they speak English and Hindi, or the Philippines, where they speak Filipino and English and everything else. You get this kind of merger of it. Or Japan, that's another one. You get this merger of these languages, and after time, more and more time, these languages will merge more and more and create an entirely new language. So don't be all like, oh, kids today with their frickin' internet speak and all this other stuff and this language I don't understand and everything else, and just admit that that's just the natural progression of language, and that's just how it works. And opposing that is like opposing, I don't know, natural evolution, which people do. It's more that they say it doesn't exist than it's happening, opposing it actually happening. That'd be like saying that someone can't adapt. You lost your job in this field, you're not allowed to go to a different field because you were trained in that field. You can't just switch jobs. You can't do that. So, yeah, it's actually extraordinarily interesting. Instead of, just shutting yourself off from it, you should welcome it and expand upon it, and, you can even add to it. So, I mean, Shakespeare. Look at fucking Shakespeare. Everyone, looks at Shakespeare as, the pinnacle of the English language, when in reality, he made up, hundreds of fucking words that nobody used before until him, and he came up with words. Even common words we use, like elbow, he came up with. So, people from them, they're like, what the hell is this guy doing making up all these words? You can't just make up words and stuff, speak English here. They would have said that to fucking Shakespeare, but nowadays, we use the words he came up with, and we have him as, we put him up on an altar as, the pinnacle of English language. So, people nowadays who are opposing it, they're going to get lost to history, and the people creating the new dialect are going to get remembered. Well, not really, because no one's actually, coming out with this stuff, because it's just internet people who aren't actually, creating plays and whatnot like that. No, because it's easy. Anyone can contribute, and sometimes you just have an experience you just can't describe properly without, in the limited vocabulary that exists, because you just need to add a new word. You need to merge two words together to properly, whatever, like petrichor. That didn't exist until a couple decades ago, and even then it wasn't even used until a couple years ago when it appeared on Doctor Who. So, yeah, and it means it's the scent, it's the way everything feels and smells right after a rainfall. Because everyone knows that feeling, and you just couldn't describe it until they came up with a word for it. And that's just how language works. So don't oppose it, embrace it. Thanks for listening.